Yeah. So the first question itself is, how do we deal with the package management, right? Like I'm just touching the basics here. Like we can look into the code, feel free to shoot questions, anything. So usually people sort of mix up the config loading in main itself. Like in Go, the idiomatic thing is, hey, under CMD, you put different kind of applications. It could be CMD server, it could be a CMD worker, or it could be some agent, anything, that kind of stuff. And then main is our regular flow, right? And so in this case, it's easier to sort of have the configuration here itself. But the problem is the config is referred by multiple packages. I'll be referring it in, let's say, ping users. Like I'll give a context on this, but yeah, just 1 second. I'll give a context on that. But the package is sort of used across. So in a sense, it is not exactly an anti-pattern in a sense that, hey, it's equivalent to utils or a models, but rather anything, I sort of see it as anything like which deals with the configuration. In this case, loading. In this case, it could be unmarshalling or converting into different required configs into the config. And like the reason I sort of have a separate package is, right now you can have a env variable, but you can move it to YAML or a different kind of library as well. So in that case, having a separate package and having a particular struct and then a load module, like I sort of see this as a three thing. Like one is whatever application requires, you define a struct for it, and then the configuration. This is a mandatory configuration to bootstrap your application. Then you have a loader logic, like this could be loading from YAML or env variable or anything. And then we pass this application across packages as needed. This is just like a bootstrapping config. I'll sort of differentiate the other kind of configs as well. But in terms of HTTP service, in this case, this simple API is just doing a ping pong response. And then it has some auth mechanism where we just connect to DB. But in super high level, like some user listing, some ping pong ping, and then it responds with pong. And then we have a DB to deal with. That's it. So in this case, as you can see, I want a port, I want a host, and then the scheme as well. And then the database configuration. So in this case, like I'll come to this in a bit, why this is different package. This is just to sort of express the other intent. But in a high level, we would have a struct, and then we would be loading the configuration and then returning this application. So in main, how it would look like is this: hey, just do a load, and then I bootstrap the server with the configuration. And then here I would be using the configuration as needed. So let's say here I'm using config app address, right? So there is multiple bits and pieces, which is like there is different kinds of thing I'm doing here, right? So I'll just add it here. One is config has a struct. This is one. Different package has a struct, which is in this case dbi.config. I'll come to this. And then there is some function which is exposed in the config package, and then obviously load or must load. So these are the like different things which is going on, right? So this is straightforward, right? Like I think it's really nice to have a struct. If you use a flag, let's say, you can have a simple variables, and then you can pass around the variables. But the problem is right now my server doesn't have HTTPS protocol. But the moment I add a HTTPS protocol, I would need cert configuration as well. And in certificates configuration, it could be CA certificates, the client, the key and PEM and everything. But I can also add configuration more and more. So in that case, this particular server, which is depending on this config application, it could be just config. Let's say server. It's easier to pass a struct, which can be like extended rather than passing 4 or 5 variables. So here I could have just passed host and address, right? So that's why it's easier to sort of have a struct. The second bit is this is, I'll come to this in a bit. Why do we, like, would you choose a function like this? You can call it like a singleton or a config package function. Or would you also always prefer passing struct across all the packages, right? So in this case, what I choose is, if you need to do any custom, like you never change the config, first of all, like treat this like a finalized or a constant values. You should never read the, once you read the configuration, you should never touch it or change it. Like that's sort of like a standard. But now, right, I don't really bother about the struct details in server starting as long as I have the address. So in this case, it is just now host and port. But let's say, hey, 1 second. In this case, it's just host and port. But if you add an additional example of, let's say, you are connecting to a database. While connecting to a database, you would have seen it has a DB name, it has a DB port, as well as credentials, username and password, along with some disable mode, SSL mode, and all of that. So in that case, in our application, we don't really bother about the specifics of the configuration, but rather what I'm interested in is only the URL, or in that case, like the DB connection URL. I can go on with additional example. Feel free to shoot if you still like have questions. Other examples could be is you are pointing to a, let's say, external services. You just need to bother about the base URL. I don't really bother about what is the protocol, what is this, and all of that, right? In terms of a client. So in those cases, I prefer this kind of func. So in server context, app address. For a DB, it's a DB connection URL. But other things, like let's say, hey, user specific config. Let's say I'm adding something like a user specific config. This could have multiple embedded values in it, right? So let's say I have this auth enabled. So, and then let's say flow, some string. These are all needed for the code flow to decide whether you want to do the auth or not. So in this case, I wouldn't really just expose a function on saying whether auth enabled or not. Later on, I could say, hey, whether the user is super user, whether it's an internal call, whether it's a public call, all of that, I can do a multiple flow, and then that auth package could deal with the handling of the flow. So mostly you would pass structs around. If you don't need the struct specifics, just use a func. So in that case, it's easier to also test it, because it's easier to sort of make a mistake on creating the JDBC like database URL in different packages, but rather the code is sort of pulled out here and then you sort of test it, right? So I can create a test saying, read the database config and then verify the URL is always the same. And the moment as long as I use this func across packages, I think you're good to go. So that's the second bit. I'll just go to the blah. The third bit is when do you decide on like whether to have this struct within this config package, or do you have the struct in a different packages? There is two cases to it. So one is the package itself becomes like a component, or you can treat it as like for libraries case, or for external clients, HTTP client, or like in general, you call it a client. You want to call a remote service. In that case, it could be gRPC, it could be HTTP, it could be HTTPS. But all of this requires some configuration, and I wouldn't use the config package to have this struct, but rather this is passed from the code flow. I mean, you still have to get the configuration, but this could be based on other configurations, right? So usually what we would do is, just a second, I had a code. Yeah, so in this case, I would usually prefer a client.new with a configuration. You can use a functional options as well, but how you read these configurations is not part of this, right? But rather the configuration is meant for that particular package, and then you customize the usage of that package with the config defined in that. I mean, I hope I'm making sense. So it's like if you create a client for, let's say, G-Cloud, if you create a client for AWS, the configs are defined in that because it's external library. In a similar way, you can sort of isolate the package usage and then how it's defined based on the domain and business context. And then same way, you can separate the configuration. Example, auth, if it's super complex, if you have, let's say, OAuth or YubiKey and different kind of thing, the auth module itself could take a config struct while initializing or creating the struct which will be used later on. So in the same way, the DB, right? Like I have used a different package. Here, I just wanted, like here, we don't have a, like other functionalities. But the reason I pulled out it is this could be even a separate different Go module itself, because all of your services in whole org would be talking to, let's say, MySQL, Postgres, and the configuration will mostly be same. Like, of course, within team, you can sort of define, hey, I'll be using this config module, which gives me a connection to a database. So in this case, I don't really need to bother about defining all of this again and again, but rather you define the whole everything which is required for connecting to a Postgres, be it through SSL or just with username and password, or even without password with same defaults. And this you could use across different services. So in this case, as I said, right, like the URL is part of this. And mostly while creating the other dependencies, we usually give out just a database URL or the configuration, like just for connection and just for dealing with creating new connection pools and stuff. So you don't really bother about these fields, but like you sort of club it, right? Database, the connect configuration for that is within that package itself. And then if you take like G-Cloud or AWS package, the config is within that. And then you define methods on that particular config, and then you use it as needed, right? So here, even creating database, this could be like something which is like good to share, because the reason is I've seen some services having a connection leak because they don't really handle connection pool properly. So in this case, you can move the config there, but the functionality also, you extract it in the right place. So I'll come to this again. So you usually group the struct, like variables or configurations in a struct. It's easier to pass a struct rather than a single variables. You expose function in config if you don't really bother about the specific variables in the config, because I can form a URL from the variables based on some custom need. You decide a separate package or external library. If it's external library, it's clear. If you can decide an external package or internal package to have its own configuration, if the config is complex enough, because you don't want to have auth depending on config as well. So you sometimes have to avoid the cyclomatic complexity as well. So in that sense, you have to have the definitions defined in that configurations. The last bit is you just need to figure out, hey, whether while loading configuration, right? Like still now we have not talked about the code, but like we'll get into it. There is just two means of loading configuration. One is must load, the other is like, hey, you load and then handle the error. So like as it stands, like if you don't have the configuration which is required for your application, let's say a port to run or a particular protocol to run, you can kill the server, because this is sort of mandatory. So it is like here you can say that, hey, this should always return an error, But if you consider this is sort of mandatory, you can use this approach. But if not, you can convert this to, let's say, error, and then you return errors to the caller. But usually this error is something which we can't handle. So in that case, you can have this kind of must load. So in that sense, your main wouldn't look like a error handling. Like you don't need additional error handling. It's going to be the same. So in that case, you can choose to panic as well, just for a configuration, because usually we avoid panic. But yeah, you load config. If the config is not available, your services can't run. So you just do a log fatal and then stop the server. I can talk about the code and libraries and stuff, but any questions on how this is structured, why this config package is here, feel free to shoot. I can take questions. I'll just stop here. Any questions?
So
yeah, go on. Sorry.
I have. Hi, my name is Abhay. So I have a question that you're using functions to pass on new instances of structs, right? Matlab, you don't want mutability, or there is another reason for it.
So I mean, mutability, like since you mentioned it, we won't share a struct, and then the struct shouldn't be changed in the code flow, because these
and
shouldn't
that's
change,
the
right?
agenda for functions, right? That's the agenda of the functions, right? You're saying.
Not really. Like I can even say, hey, I can return a pointer. Like nobody is going to stop you from writing a function which returns this. But what I meant is treat this like a singleton function where I don't need a the config structs or a dependency on config, but rather you just need the address. So in this case, like I can go into any func, and then let's say I can define this, and then I will have this. So this is what I mean. So this is different than passing it. So in this case, there is an additional benefit, right? This goes, the dependency doesn't have to be passed in the flow as well. You get what I'm saying, right? So let's say, hey, if you take a database, if you take a service dependency, you always have to pass it in the handler in turn pass it.
Yes, I do.
Or anything. But if you create this kind of exposed or exported function, you don't have an explicit dependency on config itself. As you can see, like the moment I add it, like config is gone. That's the bit. There is additional benefit to this, rather than, it's more of a usage rather than just saying, hey, like hey, use this in this way or other way. Like you can have a look at some applications, and then you will get to know, like you can use it in both ways, is what I mean by that. Like the other alternatives, let's say you can define server S, and then let's say pass an address, and then this in turn doing the same thing. You can do the same stuff. But in this case, you would have to pass the server in the modules or packages wherever you need it, and then that in turn can call it. Like this almost looks like, hey, you add additional functionality, you can validate and then call something. But this just removes the need for passing this configuration or need to have a dependency on the config itself. Yeah. Am I like is my audio clear, or is it better?
Dinesh, hello.
Yeah. Hi.
No. I was saying that your screen is getting stuck and audio is not clear, but I understood the whole spirit of it.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's just lag. I'll take questions without sharing the screen. Let me know.
But I understood. So you want actually just the address to be passed. That's an immutable form, not the pointers.
Correct. Yeah, super high level, like don't pass point. Like I mean, this is a different statement. You don't need always at all in your application unless you really need to change the struct in the flow. Because I've seen people passing a pointer thinking this would save me memory, but I've seen it being like it'll sort of confuse me. Hey, is the flow sort of going to change the configuration? That's a different thing. In this case, like load the config, even though it's big, just give a value based, we pass it by value and then you're fine. Like it's perfectly fine.
Understood, understood. So the development becomes very complex while debugging, while you start passing pointers.
Correct. Yes. Any other questions? Sorry, somebody had something like, come on, you can shoot.
So I had one other thing to add to the pointer thing.
Yep.
So while passing pointers also, I mean, sometimes if you forget to, dereference to a struct or something, which is, being populated in the request or something, so it could cause a memory leak, which could be very difficult to debug.
Entire process of debugging becomes very complex if you start passing pointers, irrespective of memory leak. It's become frustrating.
Yeah. So I've seen applications like it could be as simple as you're looping through a variable and then you're using a pointer, but it can mess up your whole code, and then you would see issues. Like I've debugged, spent so much time on others' code, and then figured out, hey, it's misuse of pointers. But rarely we bother out memory, right? I don't remember an instance where I was bothered with, hey, you're using too much memory for a binary or our application. So yeah. Any other questions on this config bit? Like, hey, which ones to choose, or like just the high level bits? Anything? Like, so if you're writing CLI, you would use a flag. If you're writing application, you would use a library and then load it and then to start.
Dinesh, your voice is cracking actually.
Yeah, I think my internet is bad. Let me just switch my host. Sorry.
Dinesh, your network is.
Yeah. Hey, is it better now? Oh, okay. Hey, it's my bad. Just give me 1 sec. Like I was connected to VPN. That screwed up the connectivity. Just give me a. Hey, can you hear me now? Is it clear? Hey, am I audible? Hey, folks, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
This is better, right?
Extremely.
I'm really sorry. Like I had my VPN connected, which sort of messed up the whole thing. I was surprised. Okay, cool. Now this should be clear.
Yes.
We'll get back to this. So in this case, I like there is different kinds of defining configuration. That's this, and then there is different like just super high level practices you can use. But I think if your org sort of define the structure, I think you wouldn't worry about it. Which one to use, but mostly, hey, how do you load it? How do you use it across and things like that. Just an additional point, right? Like I'll clarify. Like I also mentioned it earlier. Don't treat this as like an anti-pattern where it's a utils package or a models package. This does additional bits of loading. Like I'll give you an example. Today you're using let's say Viper. That's super complex. You want to replace it with some other libraries. All you need to do is touch one particular package, and you're all good to go. And same way, if you define the address or if you define the structs there, you change it here and then you're sorted everywhere. Like the same goes for logging. Will add there, but it's I mean you sort of do it intuitively, right? It's a different thing. But for components, right? Sorry. Sure. But for components or for a code flow, like you try to use a configuration which is defined in their own packages. So I wouldn't say, hey, if you're creating like a new service, you don't need to have a service configuration in the config package, but rather it's defined internally. Like just probably will go here. I have a new service, and then here we are doing some new service. Here we are just taking DB configuration, but if we want to add additional configuration which is specific to this package, I would be defining that config here, and then usually use functional options to override that, or like that. That's sort of the idiomatic way of doing things. That's this last line. There are multiple libraries which is available for loading. I personally love env config because now I can get to the code. Because all you need to do is define a config struct, and then you don't really need to write any complex code, and then the code is available, like the config is loaded into the struct. So in this case, I sort of have a, like I'll show the env variable first. Like this is just for the demo purpose, right? So I have a prefixed, like as you could see, this is clubbed. This is sort of easier to find. Like I personally like prefixing env variables for modules or for a domain with a prefix. Two things. One is it's easier to search, like even in prod and things like that. The other thing is even this could be like, let's say server host and server port, etc. And then all of this sort of converts into a particular struct. So if you take this particular thing, and then let's go here. Like we'll just look at the mappings. We don't need to define any extra code to read it. Like in Viper, I've seen so many applications reading env variables manually and then sort of putting in a struct, and then converting types as well. But the library takes care of dealing with the types and then also like standardize it. So in this case, let's go here. So I have a server, and like before this, let's say, hey, if I go here, I have a host and then I have a user, but I have mentioned prefixing DB to load all this configuration. So you would have a DB host. This maps to this and this. DB password is this, and then DB port is this. And max. This is another interesting bit. Let's say if I want to add a DB max idle connection. Let's say, hey, max connection lifetime thing. This will be defined in a, sorry, this will be caps. The camel case sort of converts into underscores, and then this splits the word. So you can say that, like I always have splits was true for all the variables. So in this case, it becomes export db SSL mode, and then you just need to say something. This is much more convenient. The last bit is, I think we need overriding. So the standardize it, you can add a prefix, and the last bit is overriding. Let's say, hey, for some reason, I use SSL mode already in my application. Let's call this, let's say, a PG SSL mode. You can override this with env variable. So, so in this case, I have defined env config port. So if I remove this, it will be different. Like this is sort of in a root level. In the same way, you can define a env config and then call it PG SSL mode, and then this will map that particular key into the struct. So you pretty much have all the stuff you want in this, and then the loading becomes super simple, which is just like I haven't figured out nested structs like it supports it, but I think I just like the naming convention this way. So in a root level, I load the configuration. Like I usually have server and port as a prefix, but the reason I have not prefixed it is because some deployment applications, like let's say, I don't know, DigitalOcean or other application, it requires port and host as a simple variable. So that's why I sort of had that. The DB is prefixed with this, and then as you can see, you can change it to even PG, and then all you require is changing your local.env file to db to, let's say, pg underscore, and then this should still work. So I hope you can follow the commands. Like I'll also enable this.
Dinesh,
Yeah.
one question.
Yes.
Abhishek here. One question, when you write in process without any prefix, then will it load all the environment variables?
No. So while what do you mean it will load all the environment? It will load the env variables and map it to these particular stuff. That's it, right? So it will look for env variables with this particular prefix.
So without any prefix, how will it know that which one is prefixed and which one is not prefixed?
Okay, correct.
Without any
yeah, that's sort of a different question, right? So by default, in the VM, you would have too many variables. The application or the code logic have access to it. So in this case, I have too many things. So let's say in a deployed VM, right, you will have the env variables required for Postgres, internal Postgres, and then you would have it for, let's say, some syslog. Additionally, you would have extra variables defined. So in this case, I will have to do a source local.env, and then if I do env this, you can see, right, like the same env would have my configuration as well. So you can see, right? So this should be done first. Like this is sort of like the deployment process, like if you do it, and then the application just reads it. So if I do this, this should be available. The same thing, right? So everything should be loaded first, and then you read it, and then you just map it. So the library is just a nice thing. Like you're not mapping it by yourself, and then you are not figuring out in what platform how to read it and things like that. You can internally say, hey, os.getEnv, and then sort of map it to this particular variable and things like that. But this is just nice way of writing, right? That's it. So in this case, like again, like I have loaded it, and then now if I try to run it, this should run seamlessly without any issue. Yeah, sorry, I have defined SSL mode. Yeah. I'll just try to run it. Yeah, and then I say curl, and then it works. So in this case, right, like right now it is using PG, but earlier I had a different DB configuration. So let's say I do a source local, and then I do a run again. Yeah, okay, just one minor bit. So I have to create a new tab or terminal because the env variables which I've sourced is already available there. So because of which it worked, now it should fail because it says, hey, PG host is not available. So usually it's even a better thing to have, like not have exports within your local file or env file. While starting, you can actually do something like env cat local.env and then exargs -n1, and then you can run your application. So this is actually how to put it. So let's say if you have a password to a very critical AWS host or some privileged thing, rather than you adding env directly, the other alternative is this. Like, I mean, of course, this will have to be encrypted and then decoded and all of that. If I do echo $DB password, it wouldn't be visible, but rather this is just available to this particular application. So this is sort of better than this, but this I have done just for the demo purposes. So yeah, we are using env config here, and then all we say is env config process, and then we say, hey, app server. One catch is obviously all the fields have to be exported. Like in Go, export is basically if you have a caps lock, like first letter as caps, then these are all exposed. This particular variable, let's say, is not accessible by the other library. So because of which you will not be able to set this itself. Yeah, you load it and then you use it as it is. And then if you want to change from env config to some other library, all you have to do is touch this code, and all of the other code remains same in your application. So
Now, Dinesh, one question.
Yeah, go on.
This env configuration, will it do we have a default configuration and a local one for developer, which is ignored file, and we can every developer can append or modify, extend that some configuration, and it will merge to the default one, or how is it for env config?
No, sorry, I missed the question. Could you simplify it and ask?
Is it?
Yeah.
Normally, like in env files, we have a default env file with some defaults already mentioned, and that is added to the repo. And each individual developer, if they want a different configuration, they would create a local.env file and or development.env file, local development.env file, and then they will add their own custom changes values for those environment variables, and it would in the application while loading, it will merge it will take the default and then merge on top of, override that with the custom configuration.
Correct.
So is it something like that for env config module?
Okay, so I don't know what you mean by the default configurations, but I'll go here and then sort of share this for DB thing. So, I mean, if your VM has default config, that's a different thing. But while deploying RAID, we don't have access to that. Like the deployment would have.
No.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Sorry, go
okay.
on.
What he means is that sometimes what happens is config files. You have three types of files: default, development, and production.
Sure.
In development environment, the variables of default get overwritten except the parts which are rewritten. In
Right.
productions, so that's like something like passwords. You keep host ports and those things constant over the in
Right.
development production. What's same? Only the passwords get rewritten in development production.
Right.
So in that case, we have three files. So I think .envs don't provide that.
Okay.
So like in Node.js, we have that kind of a thing.
Node.js configs.
.env module has that. .env module for Node.js has this in npm. They have this, like they override the local environment files. They have, if we specify local -development.env and we ignore that file, that is basically something each individual developer, they will add that local -development.env in their local and override some of the configuration for their own local environment. Some of those three files default.env, development.env, and production.env, they will be committed. Those are some kind of a default. Anyway, it will be overridden in the deployment by Kubernetes or something. But something which the developer, while testing it locally, if they want to use some other configuration, let's say they have a different MySQL username or password, so they will be adding that in the local -development.env file, and the application while loading, it will automatically take the overridden config environment. So that's how the .env module actually behaves.
So I'll sort of clarify, right? Like I'll just pitch for others as well. So I do get where you're coming from in Node.js and other applications, but rather I'll sort of separate it. Do not worry about the ecosystem, language ecosystem. So in your case, the .env files, like there are some bash command line utils which automatically loads the .env file. So in that case, if I have, let's say, something in .env, it would be automatically loaded in my space, like the env variable scope, right? So for those cases, if it's almost like an overriding, but env config is purely reading from env. Whatever you have in this place, env, that's what it's loaded in, like that's what it's accessible in the env config. If you have two env files, you would have to source it, let's say source.env, and then let's say, hey, source development.env, and then run your application. So this is still needed. So whether you have the default values by choice, like how it is defined, how that is done, it depends on the language, but you should have the values defined here. So if I do a echo something, if it is available, then the env config will have access it. So in this case, right, I have some local.env file, .env file, but I don't have any custom setup to load this particular configuration. So what I would have to do this is still do, let's say, hey, source.env. Then if I do this, then it's accessible. But with respect to env config, right, whatever it is available, it overrides it. So in this case, if I do source.env and then if I do source local.env, local.env takes the precedence. But what is better way of defining defaults in this case is env config allows us to define something called defaults. And those are something we don't need to define it. So in this case, I don't necessarily need to give db port in local.env. So the application itself has a default values. And while running it, you give all the other mandatory variables. So the mandatory is actually mentioned by a required true. So if you notice, hey, all other variables, I've given some same defaults. And then if you notice local, I don't give max idle connections. I don't give all of that. Even db port is not like we don't need to give it. So the application gives that flexibility. So maybe while looking at libraries, you can see whether it allows default, whether it allows customization and things like that. That makes sense, right?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. If anyone else have questions as well, do shoot. So I think in this case, we covered like different things as well. So how it is, the naming is naming conventions are handled. It allows default configuration. So in that sense, you don't need to define all the variables. You give some same defaults. And then while reading it, it reads it into a struct. And then you can also say some are mandatory. So if those are not available, it will fail. If you don't have this, then it will say, it will move on. Like this is not sort of mandatory. You don't have a default as well. So I can change it to, let's say, hey, password, it doesn't have to be required. But in that case, it will take the empty and then it will move on. So in that sense, it's much better to sort of say, I always need a port and I always need a host to be mandatory. So if we don't have this, our application would have a different error while running the application. So we can just try it. So in this case, I don't have a host. Nothing is there. So I'll just do a run. So example, if you could see here, right? I think, yeah, it says dial DCP, lookup random, no such host. This is sort of harder to debug than, let's say, hey, your configuration is not loaded. So in this case, I say required, and then this will be much better. Yeah, I hope I have the compile as part of this. Like I don't have the, okay, I have this. Let me just check. So this has required. I don't have the host. It should fail in configuration, but I'm just checking what is getting changed. So let me just rerun this for running migrations. Oh, it's failing in the migrations itself, I guess. So maple cmd. Yeah, so in this case, you can see, right, error loading configuration, required host missing. Like earlier, I had the migrations there, it's failing for a different reason. But now it's pretty clear that, hey, these configurations are not loaded. And then, like, I don't know whether you've noticed, in prod, if you miss some env variables, it'll fail. And then while running it again, we will figure out that there is additional env config which we need to add. But in this case, if you define all of that as required, it will say all the variables which are missing in configuration, and then it will mention at one shot. So that way it's easier for us to sort of debug as well. Cool. So any questions on the env config or how do you do loading and then using the configuration? If not, I can move on. Like I think I've taken more time, in fact. If no questions, I'll move on to the logging.
No questions.
Awesome. So just again, like I think have a look at the libraries internally. Like in this case, configurations, loading, use it from based on your usage and then your requirement. Like I wouldn't use a Viper for loading a YAML, but rather there are some small libraries to load YAML configurations, because Viper is like any format into this, but it's still pain. Like I personally don't use it. In that sense, there is tons of libraries out there which is available. So we can just try it out and then use what is like what works best for you. So logging, right? Logging, I think it's sort of similar to config, right? Like irrespective of any service, we need to have logging, right? And then we do have to log like in a right manner with right levels to sort of debug properly. But there also, like I've seen different services, different repos and teams handling things differently. More than logging as mandatory, I've seen like the logging dependencies being passed around as a painful thing, rather than, hey, it's set up nice. And also like I'm going to the specifics, but rather how you define packages in this case also helps you easily refactor and then move to a different package at later point. I think recently there were issues with log4j. If you use log4j across all the code, it would have been painful to remove the dependency. But imagine in this case, you're defining a package called logger, and then wherever you use logging, you only call logger.errorf. So in that case, I don't need to change the whole. I mean, I don't need to touch the code across, let's say, CMD, DBI, migrations everywhere, like every other packages, but rather all I have to do is change from here to some other library, and then I'm sorted. So in this sense, I personally prefer Logger as a separate package. And the major another reason is like I have seen something like, hey, logger.setup, and then it would give you a log instance, and then people have to pass across. People do pass across something like logger along with context. Now log becomes another important like critical, like not critical, but as a mandatory thing to pass across everywhere. This also becomes a pain, like it's an additional thing, right? And then it's not readable, but rather this I feel is much more readable. So if I have any error, so I'm just going here. So if I have any error, all I do is logger.errorf, and then you're sorted. So you don't need to worry about the dependencies being passed here. It's almost like a singleton, or hey, that package you're directly accessing the exported function. So this I personally prefer than you creating a logger and passing it across for the reasons I've mentioned. Yeah, I think like the other things I look for is like obviously like it needs to have a levels, but I think there is a blog on by Dave Cheney as well. Like we don't need that much of complex levels, because one is we never enable, like we don't usually enable, like warnings are usually ignored rather than being looked at. Errors, debug, and info, I think that's the major thing I've also personally used. In prod, you usually want to have like only critical errors, so that way you don't end up bloating your log files in turn, like using so much of disk size. Then you need to worry about log rotation and all of that, right? But at worst case, you would still require some debug logs. So in that case, you can debug some specific flows. So in that case, like error, debug, and then info personally have worked for me. But the point is, if you're using a library, choose a one which has log levels, right? And then you can enable a particular level and then disable all other levels. And the other important point is JSON format or custom format based on your need. The logging libraries have means to mention what kind of output format you have. Like I've seen, like mostly we have centralized logging, and then if you use some kind of a log search or other means, you need to have a JSON that in turn like used by the library and things, right? So the format is also something which is critical, because if I print a empty line, like if I print a line like this is not searchable, or this doesn't follow format, but rather you have a particular format, like, hey, this is the host name This is the IP, this is the API, and then this is the status code and things like that. Like you have a key value pair, something like that. So you should have fields, like sort of a key value pairs available in the log libraries. And the last bit is performance. Like obviously there is again tons of libraries available. Like I've used from like different libraries over time. Like very early on, I used to use Logris, like that was famous for like JSON logging. Then I moved on to Zap because it had a much faster performance. Then recently I majorly use Zero Log. You should look at benchmarks while picking libraries. So in this case, maybe you can check, like I found some blog where you can see the Logris performance is way higher. It sort of takes like 1,500 nanoseconds, but Zap takes 286 nanosecond and Zero Log sort of takes 30 nanosecond. The reason this is very critical is because the number of HTTP API calls you do, and also the number of logging we enable, right? Like we log like a lot of things in our flow. So in that case, the performance is super critical because this can cause or increase the latency for your API as well. So look at the benchmarks. You can also look at the metrics like shared here. You can see, right? Logris is way down in the performance, be it the memory utilized or be it the performance. So Zero Log and Zap is in the top. Like I've seen Zap mentioning Zero Log. They are better than Zero Log. But again, like you can choose either of these based on the constructs or the API, right, interfaces. So here, like if you notice, right, like I was using log package before this, and then all it took me was to like sort of use a Zero Log. I just have to change this particular log file, and then I got Zero Log enabled. So it's easier to change the library. It's easier in the context of changing files. So this is way better. But again, the default, like this particular log doesn't have log level, right? Like that's a downside to it, the default log. So like I'll just go here. So in this case, as you can see, like we always say like logger.rrf. It doesn't matter what library I'm using. Just the last point is you have to decide on where to log things as well. Let's say, hey, the HTTP handler is calling services. So in this case, I have service.total users. You could be logging here as well, or you could log in the caller as well. But I personally prefer log in the caller in the top level, because that service can in turn call other DBs and stuff. But you wrap errors over time. Like you keep on wrapping, like before you return error, right? Like this is not the like standard. Let's say, hey, you do error fetching users, and then you do wrap. Like it's a different than %v, and then you return that. So that way you have the context on where the error occurred. So it'll be like error fetching users, and then within this place, it'll be like error fetching count from DB. So you will have the context on the whole error. It's not just saying SQL no rows, and then you log at the HTTP handler. So that way you don't have multiple lines for the same call, but rather you have a detailed log on the whole flow, like just on the one high level, top level thing. So yeah, I think that's that. Like I'm just sort of wrapping it quick because like I'm taking more time. Log at the high level. Like I personally use singleton, like a different package. It's easier to replace a library or change the constructs or add additional fields, additional context while logging. Like let's say, hey, I want to add timestamp. Let's say I want to change the format. It's way easier if I use a logger package. And the very important thing I personally like is I don't have to create an instance of logger and keep passing it around. Because if you look at Logris library, like you would have to create a instance of it with the configuration, and then you would have to pass it around. So that's a painful thing rather than using it at the high level. So as you can see, so you can see like it gives out a log instance, and then like I've seen people passing this around. That I personally feel as a painful thing rather than nice to have. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Use benchmarks, use the ones. These are the latest ones, like Zap and the zero log. Like zero log has much better like implementation, I guess. Like there is much more context around how it is implemented and why is it better. But you can take a look at things and then pick ones which is best to you. Any questions? Any questions?
Dinesh, actually, one thing about logging, so like performance impact, if we use asynchronous logging, so will that affect performance? Will it improve the performance if we use async everywhere in
Correct.
the log?
You can. So in terms of API latency, you would save it. But there is a downside, right? If I have 3 APIs, if I have multiple logs, if it's messed up, then you wouldn't know what order it is, right? So, sorry, go on.
Go on, Dinesh. Yeah.
Okay. So if you're fine with mismatch of ordering, I mean, it's possible that like one service is calling 3 APIs, and then let's say, hey, the second API is the cause for a failure, and then that in turn will fail the third API. You would see, like, I mean, what I'm trying to say is 1, 200, 2, let's say 401, and then 3, let's say 500. It's possible that you see this, and then it would sort of confuse the callers. If you are fine with that, you can use it. But if not, the memory impact is still same depending on the library you use. So yeah, like again, memory footprint is small in that sense, it's okay. But again, like that's the major issue I see, because we want to be the logs to be like exactly in order while we debug it. But if not, I think it's fine. You can do that.
One more thing is about distributed logging. Like you said, you have a singleton and you can reuse that singleton. But in distributed APIs, we have a trace ID, and which I previously talked about it. Like we have a trace ID at the time when a new request is made. So we need to add that trace ID to that particular log. And every time we cannot just add it to the F string. So if we have a log instance created at the time of every request, at the time of every request, we have a log instance which stores that distribution ID, trace ID, then it can automatically handle that. Or should we, using a singleton, maybe we can pass a context with that trace ID?
Okay, 2 bits,
so
right?
Which one is?
Sorry, go on. Yeah, close it.
Yeah, like which one would be a better choice? Like if we create a instance every request, or should we pass the context to the singleton logger with the trace ID?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just give a bit of context for others. So more in a sense that like, hey, if you are calling API from A to B and then B in turn calls Kafka and then that in turn gets called in C and D, it's more valuable to look at the whole response time, this taking 5 seconds, rather than this service taking, let's say, 10 ms, and then this service taking 10 ms, and then here it takes 500 ms and things like that. So we capture the whole flow, like a stream of calls, like downstream, and then you club it all. Like that's the tracing bits. This is not just specific to logging, but rather for performance, latency things. You can know that, hey, the 500 is because of Kafka is down, or it's because of C timed out and things like that. Second bit is, which one is like, do you use a trace ID? There is an additional bit, right? So the moment you say, hey, you're tracking a log across, like log is basically a entry of what happened. Like if I have a timeout here, it could be because of any of this B, Kafka, or C, or any of this services timing out, like exceeding the limit. But I need to have some ID, which I print across all services. So if I say, hey, 1, 2, 3, 4 in service A is actually timed out, then I can go into logs of B and then search for logs 1, 2, 3, 4, and then see what was there. There, if it shows success, then I go into, let's say, C and then verify 1, 2, 3, 4, did it error out. So in this case, it's 500. Like there are libraries to sort of stitch, like it's called log stitching, and then this prints out multiple errors. So now coming back to your question, the first level, you can use a UUID, or usually I've seen like order IDs or a user ID being used as a trace ID. So that way it's easier to follow, like it's not just random. And the second thing is, irrespective of whether it is singleton or whether you are creating a logger instance, you would still do something like a logger.setup. Like, I mean, this could be a package, or this could be a log.setup. And then I forgot the name. Let's say, hey, open trace dot something, like you would use some middlewares. That setup you can still do for a singleton as well. So in this case, right? So I would be doing some logger.setup. And then within that setup, I'll be setting, let's say, hey, log level dot setup level, and then read the configuration and then set the level. Also, let's say, hey, trace configuration. Like we will be setting this irrespective whether it's a singleton or not. So you can still follow the same logger separate package and then call a setup with options. And then the same works. Like you don't, like it's not mandatory to create an instance per se.
Like the issue is when, like for each and every request, we are creating a new trace ID, because every request is a new request, unique request.
You will use
so
a middleware.
We want to track.
You will use a middleware.
In the middleware, we will be creating a that setup. Like we'll be having a instance of that particular logger, which will be passing through the context, or should we pass the context to the logger itself, to the singleton logger? We can pass the context, and the logger is responsible for getting the trace ID if it is present in the context.
So on a high level, like this doesn't support fields, but let's say assume it does. In this case, along with this, I'll be passing something like a trace ID, and then I'll be passing a trace ID. So the logger, as I said, like it doesn't have to care about what you're displaying. Like it's just going to display key value pairs. Whether this trace ID is ID, or whether you're going to send it as a user ID, or whether it could be a request ID which is generated from the client, as long as you're printing this, you're fine, right? So you don't need to worry about this. If you don't want to even send this, then yeah, there is a different option of passing context and then using values. But I think this is even simpler. And the last call can do it. If you use context and then set this trace ID, the logger would have to accept context, right? And then you'll be passing a context. And then there, before logging, I'll be adding, let's say, hey, context dot value, and then something like a trace ID. And then I'll be printing this along with the format. That's it, nothing else. So you get what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, that's all. Like, yeah, exactly.
That's it. So it doesn't matter. Like again, the library is agnostic. If it supports, great. But if not, it's as simple as like this could be via context, or it could be just a string. But yeah, like you can do the same thing. That's nothing else. Cool. Any questions? Like in fact, I can show you for the same thing. Like I think in this, which is 0 log. So info, let's say we have, as you can see, right, like it says dot timestamp and then that internally adds something. But this supports something called fields. Like you just need to set those fields and then you're good to go. So this is saying str, and then you can add something like a trace ID, and then you can set the ID here. Similarly, it could be a timestamp or anything, but rather the logger just accepts key value pairs. Here it's saying with the type, that's all. And this holds the same for anything. Logress has something called fields, logress.field, and then you would have to create that. But in this case, you just need to set this extra additional str, which is going to be a trace ID. Cool. Any other questions? The code is simple. Like I've pushed a simple API in remote. you can take a look at this. Like, and it's more about how you're using this package and then how you pass it around rather than just syntaxes or particular library. Yeah, just follow the benchmarks. You're good to go. But yeah, like any of the questions or anybody else have something to add, feel free to pitch. Like that's all I had. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Share.
Go
Just
on.
a small question. In a microservice environment, so where we are using the event logs, like event log services there, right? Like CloudWatch and all. So where we will use those services?
Sorry, could you repeat? Like in microservices distributed, where will use what?
Where we will use event, log event services like CloudWatch.
I mean, I'm not personally use CloudWatch. Is it a aggregation, like a centralized log aggregator?
Yeah, centralized log
It's an
aggregation.
AWS service.
Okay.
Manoj, I can answer the question. Like we have been using CloudWatch, and we use Logress, and like we use CloudWatch to add the logs in there.
Okay, so is it event it will stream the log even to CloudWatch, or we will add it aggregate in one particular log file and then we'll
As Dinesh showed, like we have a different logger file, and there we can switch, like we can add which log cloud logging we want, the cloud provider we want to use, and we can add the CloudWatch there, and it will automatically log to CloudWatch.
Okay, so for each log event it will go to the CloudWatch, right?
Yeah, we can add more providers as well as per our requirement.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
So I mean, I can abstract it a bit and then add this context as well. Like, so we talked about like just logging and tracing, but also centralized logging is also critical because as he was mentioning, like usually our production systems are of multiple instances. In Kubernetes, it's of replicas, right? And then the same service that's running in VM0, VM1, and VM2, let's say, if I make an API call from mobile, I would get a 500, but how would I know where it errored out? It could be from 0, 1, or 2. So usually what folks do is you collect the logs from all the VMs, and then you finally push it into a consolidated or like central log service, log manager, whatever you call it. And then it's easier to search for that particular error. But the definitions of how the service logs, is it to a file, is it in the JSON format, or is it directly to the remote? I think I have mostly seen dumping to a file and then further agents or like a different workers collecting that log files and then sending it across, like centralized, because this is more of async rather than like, let's say, hey, New Relic is a way different than like it's different than like writing to something via API or via statsd. So this is what I've seen, but yeah, this is helpful for debugging distributed microservices.
One more thing, Dinesh, about the ordering, if it is async, that I think the cloud services might be ordering it based on the timestamp of the particular login. So that might not be an issue much if ordering is a concern for this asynchronous logging.
Yeah. So if the provider provides it, great. Then I think it's fine. But there is one more catch as well. Like again, it's something very like niche, but rather like, hey, you shouldn't do any go routine leaks, or like if the go routines are too much, then also it's a problem, right? So as long as you pre-profed it, you profiled it, if it's all within the bounds, I think then it's great. But the other problem is, let's say, hey, what if those fails? Like, do you have a mechanism to sort of say the logging failed? Because sometimes I think we say, like similarly metrics, right? While pushing metrics, we want it to be asynchronous, but when it fails, like we don't want it to, do you want to stop the service or do you go on without the metrics? That's another small catch, like that's all. But yeah, I think if the provider provides it, great. Any other questions? I'm good. Like I'm done. Like if there is anything specific you want to go through the code, happy to discuss. If not, like I would also suggest like maybe if you could share on, like folks could share on like how your services use the configuration. Like, do you use something different than env, and also how do you sort of like manage the configuration across org? Like, because like I think we would share something. Like, I've recently found some Mozilla plugin where we encrypt the env variables, like because some of our services are critical. That was something very different. Like, usually you protect the resources it runs, but I've seen like recently some libraries you can use to encrypt with GCS security and things like that. There is a lot of levels you can do, and then deployments also different folks do differently. We have not touched the polling, watch on config and things like that, but if some of you have used it, like feel free to sort of share that as well.
Like Dinesh, so our logging system is such that we can use the custom, like we have a local div which is ignored, and a local div env, and which is ignored by default. But if someone creates a new local.env file, then it will be that overrides the other default one. That's how currently our system is.
No, that's more of a
handling,
local
but that is more
development, right?
manual.
What about prod?
Yeah. In prod, we are using Kubernetes.
Okay.
So Kubernetes overrides that.
Config management, you'd be using Kubernetes configs, right? Config maps.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
But how do you sort of like, where do you maintain the config maps then? Like, where do you maintain the resource creations?
I think that will be with the notepad of DevOps. Like.
Okay. No, it's okay. Like the reason I was asking is, again, that translate to some YAML files. Again, that is some key value pair. We would have to maintain
yes.
That's it. But like I wonder whether people have some like creative ways to sort of encrypt it, keep it safe. Because if I have access to the VM, right, I will figure out the credentials for DB. So that's what I was wondering. Cool. Anyone else, like how do you sort of like do you use any services to manage the config? Any other JSON like feel free to share what you do in your deployment as well. Like anything on logging or config different as well. Feel free to share that. If not, like we can take like some open discussions as well. Like in a bit. Anyone else, like feel free to go. I'm just gonna ask some random folks then. Who all, like, can you just raise like, hey, anyone written prod systems?
Not in Golang.
Yeah, but this is still common, right? Like config management. You can go.
So what we do is we keep it on S3, and only our system has access to pull it from S3.
But what format?
YAML.
Oh, okay. And your system, when you say, hey, it's on while deploying on the VM process, or does your services do that?
Services do that, but on the production, we have a shell script file over there. So as soon as a new deployment is hit, a webhook is hit, we trigger that method shell script, and we fetch before starting a new instance, we fetch it and then run the system.
So in this case, it's not a env, but rather you have a S3 bucket where you post the YAML files. Deployment will take care of bringing that S3 file into your VM, and then your application loads the file and then runs.
And the S3 bucket is only accessible to few people.
Is it encrypted?
No, it's not encrypted. It's not at all. We need to read also. But the only difference is that we don't use .env. We use config. That's a node package named config, and that takes care of these functionalities. Because what problem we face during .env is that it's a straight naming hierarchy, right? So it keeps on going, and sometimes that becomes sort of annoying and frustrated to see.
Right. Got it.
So YAML was the choice for it.
Got it.
I understand you have prefixes for everything, DB, server, some of the other, and that is similar to that JSON's hierarchy, right? You have underscore. but that is still frustrating to see every code in same hierarchy.
Yeah, YAML or TOML is readable, but yeah, I think it's just maintaining it, like both works. But for like sometimes I think even we folks prefer because of like hey, would you have access to like that like downloading? Do you have access to the traffic and whatnot, right? But I think yeah, it's similar. Like it's all cool. Like this is the library I was talking about. Like the same works for local.env, or it could be for YAML as well. But it's just an additional thing where you use GCS credentials and then you encrypt your YAML, and then like this is slightly like more better than just committing static files.
Okay.
Vault. Okay. Does someone use Vault something? Mahendra?
Someone typed HashiCorp Vault.
Yeah, Vault. Do you use Vault key secrets for your service? Mahendra, you can share.
No.
Okay. Whenever you're back in, like I think you can share. Like it's possible that like the service can directly access external things, but I'm not sure whether like performance wise I've not used it in prod. But yeah, Vault is also pretty cool in a way that like keeping the secrets really, like we use it for managing certificates, but key value pairs I've not used that directly for the services. Okay, you're talking in chat. Like just before discussing open questions, like I see Eduardo sort of mentioned he have something to share. Like in general, you can take this time now, like do a short intro of your company, do share the job opportunities. Like it's not a pitch, but rather I think like we are open to people sharing opportunities or referrals in your company. Earlier also we were doing in our live meetups. So, but be cautious of time. Like just take, let's say 5 minutes or 3 minutes, and then you can share it. Eduardo, if you're still there, you can talk about your company in a few lines and then share about the opportunity.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity, Dinesh. And it was also a pleasure to get to know a little bit more about Golang, even though I'm not a developer. So we're trying to spread this opportunity, especially with developers based in India, as we have several opportunities with one of our clients right now, and they are focused on a cryptocurrency platform. They're also dealing with with finance and trading stuff. So there you're gonna have the opportunity of using not only Golang as their main programming language, but also they're using some DevOps tools such as Docker, Kubernetes, AWS services. Their main one of choice is going to be DynamoDB, and they are relying on a couple of SQL and NoSQL databases, being those PostgreSQL and MongoDB. All right. So if you have any further questions, or if you want to touch base through email or on LinkedIn, both Anna and myself, we are available to answer any of your questions. And once again, Dinesh, thank you so much for letting us speak in regards to this opportunity.
Just sort of clarifying, so others also follow, like, are you looking for a specific backend devs, or are you looking for a full stack? Like, I understand like you have a different stacks to work with. It's not just specific to Go, but like, is there any specific requirements you have?
Actually, for this main partner of ours, we are looking for Golang engineers.
Okay, got it. So Go crypto space. Anybody, if you're interested, I think you can reach out to Eduardo. Like he shared his LinkedIn as well, and then his X team as well. So feel free to reach out to him. Thanks, Eduardo, for sharing this opportunity.
Thank you, Dinesh.
Yeah, anyone else, like if you have anything, like any open opportunities, or if you have, like just put it in chat if you are looking actively for a job, or if you're looking for, let's say, changing into Go ecosystem. Because personally, I've seen while having Go meetups, like there were a few folks who worked in other languages, and then through referrals, they ended up getting a Go job, and then they started loving it. So I think feel free to share, ask, and then give whatever you have as well. You can use the Slack as well. Like, I'm not sure whether everyone is in Slack. There is a Go for Slack channel. Within that, there is jobs channels, and then within, like, for specific to us, you can talk to any one of us within India or Bangalore channel. You can ask any questions, share about opportunities, or ask for any requirements or anything like that as well. Cool. Like with that, like we're done. Like anyone else has something to share?
I have a trivia.
Go on.
A question. How do you take care in Go applications layers like repositories, services, and controllers?
Okay. So it's
We can
more
have
of,
it on next meetup.
no,
Next
I
meetup is also
think
fine.
we are good. Like we can take it, not an issue. Like I anyways wanted to like keep it open.
Because
Like, yeah.
I
Sorry.
feel it's hard to find firm structures in Go compared to what it is for the Node.js stack which I come from.
Mhm. Right.
So
Yeah. So the whole MVC layer is is what you're looking at, right? We don't usually have a separate handler, separate repositories, or like it's not specific to components, but rather we club it within the same package. So anything to do with the user usually goes in user package, like listing, controller, like in this case, handler, repository also goes in this case. Like I've personally tweaked a bit and then moved DB as a separate thing, majorly because like the structs and the connections all need. So, but on a super high level, keep everything, including DB model, like models, you shouldn't have a models package. That's sort of anti-pattern. So models, views, controller, everything, right? Like in whatever the other language terms, here you club it in a same package. Like you shouldn't depend on a separate package. The nice way to think about it is, let's say, hey, the user package becomes so complex, you can move the package and then put it as a separate repository and then call it a service.
So I understand you're trying to say that modularize stuff, right?
Yes.
So we do modularize, but the question then is, do you separate repository, all the database interaction codes into a repository file and anything that is a business logic into a service file?
If you're okay, let me share this.
Further divide the context.
Correct. Okay. There is no de facto standard as such, but handlers, you don't suffix it with, let's say, handlers. Like I usually name it with, let's say, hey, list, and then let's say get and things like that. The service, I call it service, and then store is called store. Because what is more important is this place, right? You have something called user dot, like it should be just list handler, or it should be, let's say, hey, fetch user. This is what is more important than the file names, because the file names we don't bother about. But yeah, you could, like I've seen people appending handlers to it, but I think it would be as simple as like searching for a handler func, right? That's it. The handler func, I keep it in a handler func, or the server, I keep it in a separate file. Service in a separate file. Like it's better to create a service, because there is much more than marshalling and marshalling, decoding, encoding just happens. And then the store, obviously, DB is a separate thing.
Okay. So you do further divide depending on the context of the code, right?
If not, it'll just become bloated. Like you can have all of this code into the list itself. That will also work, but it'll just become bloated.
That is not fair. That is not fair to other developers or any developer.
Yeah, that's it. So the same case, right? Like list is a separate API, but both of them uses the same service. Like it depends. Like there is no like standard, or like this is the de facto thing. If you can have a smaller service in the same file, it works great. But I think DB's handler service, like I have personally split it, like others can pitch in as well.
Okay.
So I just wanted to open the floor to like anybody else sharing anything, like, because like we don't get to talk to folks, we don't get to meet folks and all of that. So I think like now I know, hey, there are some people who's repeat. So if there is any random questions, it could be even basics, or it could be even different to Go, a production system or distributed system, anything. Feel free to shoot. Any one of us will try to answer it. And if you're sort of like I'll just try to close the meet itself. Like, so in that sense, there is no mandate, right? Do join Slack group. There will be a lot of conversation. I'll keep on posting the meetup links over there as well. And then you can join a lot of good channels like New Buys, GRPC. There is a good reviews channel where you can understand how people write code, and then people do ask reviews from other people. So in a way, you're learning from their learnings. That's a good channel. You can like do join the meetup. I'm sure like a lot of you have come from that, but if you're not joined that, like join the meetup Go Bangalore. And the other important thing is please reach out to me if you have a content to talk. Don't worry about like, hey, I've not written production system. If you have written some client tool, if you have written some CLI, or if you have done like, if you've got any learnings, please feel free to share it. So in a way, like there is always like 30% of beginners in the group who doesn't have a contest and go. So it's way better to talk like the basics than let's say internals. So do sign up. So yeah, that's all. Like the floor is open. Feel free to hang out, shoot any questions. We can discuss anything in general. If you're comfortable, turn on the video also. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for joining. I'll stop the recording so that way